First of all, we're looking at really a focus of material that's in chapter 12. I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. And this chapter is called decision making. Decision making is extremely important in business. It's something that people do every single day. So really a decision is a process of really committing to some course of action. And it could be good, it could be bad. We don't know. Decisions are really a flip of a coin. Now, the problem is that that's probably not good enough for business. We need to have better decision making so that it's not just a 50-50 chance of succeeding. We need something a little bit better. So we need to think about a process that helps our decision making so that when we make a decision, it is more likely, not guaranteed, but more likely to work to resolve the issue that we're trying to receive. Decision making, we saw, was relatively easy when we have a situation where we have what's called a well-structured problem. And a well-structured problem is really a problem that's very clearly defined. We know what the options are. We know the weights of each option in terms of how valuable each option is. We know the decision criteria very clearly, and we simply make the decision based on the criteria, and voila, we have a problem solved. So you can imagine that you walk up to a Coke machine, and you have to make a decision there of what type of pop you want to buy. You put your whatever the amount of money it is, $2, whatever, into the machine, and you have a choice of 6 items: Coca-Cola, Diet Coca-Cola, Sprite, something else, something else, something else. You press the button, and voila, out comes the one. That's what's called a well-structured problem. You have a limited number of options. You have a clearly defined group of options. And when you press that button, the problem is solved. Nothing more to it than that. Generally, these problems don't exist. They're very, you don't pay good money to people to make simple decisions that are based on very well-structured problems. And even when we get into more complicated situations, what a lot of organizations try to do is to make the problem solving simple by creating something called standard operating procedures, which is a book, a basic rule book, nothing more than that, that says, if this happens, do this. If that happens, do that. So a standard operating procedure is a way to solve a problem that is known. Someone gets run over by a car. What do? Call 911, that sort of thing. The reality is most problems are not really well structured. And in business, we don't know what the options are. We don't know what the value of each option is. We don't know what the decision criteria is. We don't know if the solution will work. There's a lot of we don't knows. So this is an example of an ill-structured problem, which is so common. So this is a head scratcher because we say to ourselves, well, if we make a decision, we don't know if it's going to work or not. And if it doesn't work, that could cost a lot of money, someone's life, someone's health, whatever. So it really weighs heavy on you when you have very poorly structured decisions. So what has happened is that a lot of research has been done over the years to say, how can we really increase the probability of making good decisions in ill-structured problems? What can we do in order to kind of make it more likely that we're going to get a positive outcome? The way that the approach to that was something called rational decision making. Now, rational decision making is effectively a process for solving problems. Okay, it's a standard process. The thing is that we are human, and because we are human, we do not necessarily use rationality all the time. So, human nature gets in the way of rational decision making a lot. Now, if we look at rational decision making, it really has a number of key parts. And this is an example, Exhibit 9.1, that was in your book, where we say, okay, first thing we need to do is define the problem. That's a little harder than it seems, but sometimes we just need to define the problem. What is the gap between where you are and where you want to be? That's the problem. Then you say, okay, well, what is the criteria that you're going to use to assess potential solutions? Is it the right color? Is it the right size? Is it readily available? Can I get it in time? These are criteria that you would use, for example. Certain criteria are worth more than other criteria. Safety, for example, is usually a very, very high criteria. It's very heavily weighted. Whereas the color or the shape of it may not be such a high criteria whenever we're, so not all criteria is equal. So certain things are must have, other things are we'd like to have. So we need to kind of figure out, well, if this is going to be our criteria, what is the must haves, what is the like to haves, and what is the, well, you know, if it's there, great. So we need to kind of weight our criteria to say what's most important, be able to prioritize, I can't say prioritize. Anyway, to be able to sort out what's important. Then we use this decision criteria that we've developed using the weighting system to develop potential alternatives. What are some of the potential solutions to this particular problem that we've run across? So we'll probably come up with 4 or 5 solutions, of which one might be do nothing, right? So we then need to take this criteria and apply it to each of the alternatives. You know, is it the right color? Is it the right shape? Is it too heavy? Is it too big? Is it too small? Is it safe? Is it not safe? Can we get it on time? These then will be used to kind of say, okay, this option, not available. This option, not so good. This one here is the best option. So we select the best option. So that's effectively this rational decision-making process. It takes us through a rational series of steps that hopefully will give us a really good decision that is the best one to resolve any problems. There's a whole bunch of assumptions that are in place in order to use this system, right? In order to make the best out of this system. We got to assume that the problem is crystal clear, meaning that we have a good problem definition. We have defined the problem well. Not always easy to do. We got to know our options. So when we think about developing alternatives, well, what are our options? If we don't know what those are, we're in trouble because we're not going to be able to think of all the potential alternatives. There has to be clear preferences, meaning that using this evaluation criteria that we have here, we need to say, okay, that's going to point to option number 1 is by far and large the best option. Option number 2 is by far and large the worst option. Option number 3 is an option that would be good, but not as good as option number 1. So we need to be able to have clear preferences. And they have to be constant. That's one of the problems, is that things change. You know, we talked about how COVID, the options that were discussed at the very beginning of COVID eventually changed as we learned more about the coronavirus. So constant preferences was not necessarily the case. So you could argue that government wasn't all that rational when they said, don't wear your mask. We don't need to worry about masks. Forget masks. They're useless. And then 6 months later, they came out and said, well, we all need to wear masks. Well, the fact was that information changed. The background information, the research, and it pointed to the fact that masks were indeed useful. Time is always a problem. We need to worry about time and we need to worry about cost. So whenever we're looking at options, we need to think about time and cost. And, you know, it's never a fact that we got a lot of time in order to solve a problem. It really is a bit of an issue. And we want to get maximum payoff. In other words, the decision we make wants to be the most beneficial. This rational decision making is a real problem with the environmental movement. Okay, it poses a real problem to the environmental movement. You know, if you listen to very hard environmentalists speak, they say, look, the world is getting warmer. We're all going to die unless we solve this problem of we got to stop burning fossil fuels and stop polluting the atmosphere. Okay. But generally, most people look at it, the majority of people, in fact, look at it and say, I can't see doing anything that's going to change the trajectory around. I'm such a small part of the puzzle. So what they're doing is we see them really working hard to say, we need to do it now, because the time constraint, if there's a time constraint in place, it gets people's attention. And if there's no, well, we got to do something sometime. Yeah, we'll worry about it later on, right? So we're seeing a lot of the movement to try to push rational decision making, to make people make rational decisions. You know, stop buying gas powered cars or F-250s or whatever people have to cart their rear ends around. It's a very difficult sell unless people feel that it's going to have an impact on them and that it's necessary to do now. We looked at this concept too of perfect and bounded rationality. Perfect rationality assumes that you know everything and you've done your complete research, you've had lots of time, and you've made a very thorough decision process decision. You've made a very thoughtful decision. That's not always the case. In fact, most of the times we are running into boundaries, meaning we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, we're in a hurry, we ignore certain things, and those things are what are called bounds, or they put in restrictions on how much consideration we give. So this is really what we're often faced with, is something called bounded rationality. We don't necessarily take in every possible bit of information whenever we make a decision. It's just too time consuming. You know, it creates what's called paralysis by analysis. We just think too much and we don't do anything. You got to make a decision at some point in time. So we looked at a couple of little videos there yesterday on this process, and they went into the decision-making process in great detail, more detail than I really want to. But again, it demonstrated this idea of putting weights on decision factors whenever you're assessing a number of options. So I just wanted you to take a look at those. Okay, so that's where we ended up yesterday. Today, it's all good and well to talk about this stuff, but unless you can put some sort of thing that people can relate to it, it makes it very hard to really get a good grasp of decision making and some of the problems in decision making that make decisions not necessarily rational after the fact. You know, hindsight will say, well, that wasn't a very smart decision, but you know, obviously it wasn't a very smart decision after. In the front end, it looked like a good decision. Okay, and back on March 12th, it was actually around this time of the year in 2009. I remember being sat in my office and hearing this situation. This Cougar helicopter right here, an S-92, was flying out to the Hibernia platform with 19 people. No, I think it was 21 people. But anyway, it had a number of people on it. And it was a scheduled flight. It had left St. John's Airport. It had just taken off from St. John's, and it was flying out to White Rose in Hibernia. It was about 40 miles off Cape Spear, or 40 miles off Signal Hill. And what had happened is the pilot got a warning on his dashboard that said, there's something wrong with the oil pressure in the gearbox. Now, the gearbox is the part that makes the big blades up at the top spin around. And you can imagine the gearbox is a very important part because it is connected to the mast, which is this piece of metal here, and that mast holds the helicopter up. Without the mast, without these things spinning, physics will take the thing down. Gravity will take into action. Anyway, you need oil because this is a tremendous weight that you're carrying, and friction will do dangerous things to this stuff without oil. Anyway, so the captain saw the message, and he decided, okay, what I need to do is I need to get back to St. John's. So he turned the helicopter around, and he started flying back to St. John's. That was his first decision. Okay, and that was a very quick and easy decision for him to make. I got a problem, get back to land. And so anyway, as he was flying back to land, he was thinking to himself there that he has a half an hour, because it was found out in the report after, when the report was done on this crash, that all of the pilots that work for Cougar understood that this particular aircraft, which is made by Sikorsky, has what's called a 30-minute run dry capability, meaning that if it loses the oil in its gearbox, it has a half hour of time that it can actually fly without everything going kaput in that gearbox. Okay? The military version of this helicopter, which is what you see in every movie, every shoot 'em up movie you see, the Black Hawk helicopter, has what's called a run dry capacity because, bullets being shot at it and that sort of thing. You want to make sure your helicopter. And all the pilots understood that it had that feature until they realized it didn't. So Mister's flying back towards St. John's, and in fact, he says, and I'll show you in a second, he says, I want to get to, if you've ever been out to Cape Spear, he wanted to get to the parking lot in Cape Spear because it's the most easterly point in North America. And if you want to land somewhere, that's where you're going to land. You don't want to ditch in the ocean because there was 6 foot or 8 foot waves on that day. And even though that machine could land in the ocean and it has sponsons on it to keep it afloat, he didn't want to do that, understandably. Again, not all the information. Let's take a look here. The basic questions that you would ask after this accident are, what information did the pilots have? They had basic information like where they were. They knew where they were. They knew what the sea state was. They knew it was 6 or 8 foot waves. They thought about ditching, and they thought about the gearbox oil. And as I just said to you, ditching they kind of ruled out because it was kind of, big waves. The gearbox oil, they figured they were good for a half an hour. It was no sweat to make it back to St. John's in a half hour, 10 minutes flight. So the pilots thought the S-92 had this 30-minute one dry. So that kind of crossed out that option, and it kind of crossed out the option of worrying about the gearbox oil. So their only real focus was to get back to land, which is the exact same decision that you or I would have made. So what I want to do is just show you the video here. And I got to survive that accident, and he had the opportunity to tell this story. So, this was a good example of how, even though we think that we have full information, we don't necessarily have full information, and that can seriously impact our decision making. So bounded rationality comes in, especially when we have a situation like this that has the consequences of making a mistake are so great, and they were really great. Okay, so the next section looks at, okay, we know that decision making can go south if we don't do things with full information. But what other things can affect decision making? Well, as I said, we're human. Emotions and mood certainly has an impact, and a negative one, on decision making, but also there are positive elements to it as well. The very fact that we have emotion, meaning that we are concerned about our future, that forces us, our system, our body system, forces us to make decisions and forces us to be careful, so that we recognize that, we don't want to get in any trouble. So contrary to the rational model of decision-making, there is ample evidence that emotions also play a role in decision-making. Strong emotions frequently figure in the decision-making process that corrects critical errors. And so-called whistleblowers often report that they were motivated by emotion to protest decision errors. Strong or positive emotions have also been implicated in creative decision-making and the proper use of intuition to solve problems. Strong intuition can lead to successful short-circuiting the steps of rational decision-making. Gut feeling, that sort of thing. So, emotion does play into it. And what are some of the effects of that? Well, basically, research on mood and decision-making has found that people in a positive mood tend to remember positive information. Those in a negative mood only tend to remember negative information. People in a positive mood tend to evaluate objects, people, and events more positively. Negative mood, opposite. People in a good mood tend to overestimate the likelihood of good events happening. People in a bad mood tend to overestimate the negative. People in a good mood adapt and adopt swiftly. Short-circuiting decision-making strategies while likely violating the rational decision-making model. People in negative mood are prone to approach decisions more deliberately, systematically, in a detailed way. So again, maybe you get better decision-making in a negative mood. Positive mode, however, promotes creative, intuitive decision-making. So we got as many pluses as minuses. It impacts, but we can't say that, yeah, if you're in good mood, things are going to go much better. Not necessarily the case. So the impact of mood and decision making is not necessarily dysfunctional. If we have excessive optimism, that could be a problem, or excessive pessimism can be a problem. Those in a good mood can make creative decisions. Those in a bad mood might make more stoic decisions that kind of are more well thought out. There's also bias in decision making, overconfidence bias. Oh, I know that will work. Don't worry. What's the worst that can happen? Men got it all the time. I think it's built into us. Overconfidence effect is a well-established basis in which people's subjective confidence in their own judgment is greater than the objective action. I know what direction I'm going. Honestly, yeah, right. Okay. Now, we also have something called anchoring bias. And anchoring bias, or focalism, is a bias that describes common human tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information that you see. Okay? I saw a sign back there. It said turn right. That's the first piece. I haven't seen any sign since. Or that person looked nice. I figured they're a nice person. That's the person I trusted. So this is what we call our anchoring bias, and that effectively gets us in trouble because we don't use full information. We just kind of figure out the first thing we see. It's the proverbial don't judge a book by its cover example. We also have confirmation bias, and confirmation bias is I knew I was right, and I'm going to prove that I'm right because I knew I was right. Confirmation bias, also called confirmatory bias or myself bias, is a tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms my pre-existing thought. So if I have a thought or a bias that says people who smile are nice people, I'm going to assume that someone who's smiling is a nice person. That's all. I got availability bias too, and availability bias is one I run into a lot. I'm going to pick the one that's closest to me or pick the one that's easiest to get. And basically, it's a mental shortcut that relies on immediate examples. I picked the first thing that I saw as a good example. So we don't really do a big assessment. We just pick whatever's handy. And I mentioned the other day, we got this concept of escalation of commitment. Escalation of commitment is a real problem in business. Let's assume that you're a business person who's decided to invest $1 million in a piece of equipment. That's a pretty heavy decision. Okay? So you go and you buy the piece of equipment for $1 million. Something goes wrong with the equipment. Now, you've already made the decision to buy the piece of equipment. You've got $1 million sunk into it, and you say, well, gee, I got $1 million sunk into this. Now I'm going to have to spend another $100,000 in order to make it work. I'm going to spend that $100,000. So what we got is you made one decision, and that's going to impact your next decision, and your next decision, and your next decision. We've got a case in point here in Newfoundland right now, Muskrat Falls. Muskrat Falls started to be constructed in 2012. It didn't take very long, 2014, before they realized, hey, this is going to cost a lot more than it looked like. We got all these other costs. Well, what was government supposed to do? Shut it down and walk away from it? Lose all that money? No. Government said, we're going to double down. We're going to put more money into it. And $13 billion in, which is more than twice the original price, we still do not have electricity coming from Muskrat Falls. So it is a case in point of a government kept pouring more and more and more and more resources in order to get to the case. And the fact is, you're so far in, it's not as if you can turn around and go back. You got a lot of money spent. You've learned in accounting, for example, that we always use historical cost, or that we don't make decisions based on what happened in the past. Okay? Again, it's human nature in bias for decision making to escalate our commitment. In other words, if we did it, we're going to continue to do it, continue to add to it, continue to make it. So the concept of sunk costs doesn't really apply in human nature. Another thing that we need to be aware of is group decision making. And group decision making has become a very, very important topic within management research. Can groups make better decisions than individuals? Is the basic question that's asked. Okay. So are groups better at making better decisions than individuals? And there's pluses and there's minuses that have been thrown out. If we think about the pluses, okay, what is it that groups can do? Groups, they got more complete information. They got a more broader range of views. They got better decision quality because, again, the broader range of views, more thoughts, more input, more creativity, and a higher degree of acceptance. If you get more people in on the decision, more people are going to accept it if they're part of it. Whereas individuals, you can do it fast and you can do it efficiently, but you can't do it fast and efficiently if you're in a group. So the balance, if you look at the balance there, group decision making indicates that it has a more broad and better process for making decisions. So group decision making research has proven that group decision making provides better decision quality. Groups make higher quality decisions than individuals because groups are more vigilant, they generate more ideas, can evaluate the ideas better than individuals. Accepting a commitment. If more people are involved in the decision, more people buy into it. So the acceptance of group decisions is especially useful in decision implementation. And the diffusion of responsibility is a big one too. Let's assume that everything goes wrong. Let's assume that it goes wrong. If it was my decision, guess who you're going to blame? Me. If it was our decision, you're all part of it, we can spread the blame. So the fusion of responsibility effectively allows us to spread the benefit and spread the blame. And that kind of mentally is easier on us as humans. What are some of the key advantages of group decision making? Well, research has shown that groups usually produce more and better solutions. True. It's just, physics to say if everybody contributes 2 ideas, and there's 6 of us, that's 12 ideas. That's more than I would ever come up with, right? Group members differ in relevant skills. People have different perspectives. Men, women, older, younger, experienced, less experienced. They all bring the benefits of each of those into the mix. Memory for facts. The fact that you got more people means you got a broader base of facts. And individual judgments can be combined. So what I think you can add to it, someone else can add to it. We kind of snowball effect. We build on that. So these tend to be the big positive that we see with decision making. However, there are negatives as well. And if we think of the negatives are case in point. Time. It takes longer to make a decision. If you go to Ottawa, you go to St. John's, or you go to the town hall in Clarenville, it takes you longer to make a decision when you got groups involved. It's just slow. And it's supposed to be because it gives you that more consideration. Conflict. Often you get conflict in the participants, people with different ideas. Domination. Usually you get one outspoken character in the meeting. Groupthink. Now, groupthink is an interesting one. Groupthink is what happens when everybody starts thinking the same. We talked about earlier when we talked about formation of groups, we got forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. Groupthink occurs in the norming stage. And effectively, we're no longer individuals. We all start to think as one. Now, the moment that we start thinking as one, all of the benefits of group tend to disappear because, it's just like having one big head as opposed to 9 different heads or 8 different heads that are coming up with different ideas. So groupthink is when the group starts thinking as one. And it's largely because of group pressure or people just shirking back from the idea of being involved or dominating people. But generally, what it does is there is less ideas as in an environment where there's groupthink. What are some of the key symptoms of groupthink? And groupthink has been pointed out to be a big problem in group, and this is why we're focusing on it. There's an illusion of invulnerability. In other words, you can't, there's so many of us that you can't kill us all, right? So we kind of feel overconfident because you can't blame me. It's our group. There's more than enough of us to spread the load, so you can't get rid of us all. There's an assumption too of morality, meaning, well, if we all agreed to it, it must be right. There's rationalized resistance, meaning that there's enough of us thinking this way that we feel that your thoughts are not worthy. There's 8 of us making this decision, 1 of us opposing it. Forget the one that's too small. Peer pressure, pressure within the group. Minimizing doubts. It's very difficult to express doubts when you're in a meeting because what it does is it singles you out. And there's this illusion of unanimity, meaning that, well, because I'm just being quiet here, I assume that I'm agreeing.